Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back to Rats on Film, the show where a bunch of film rats talk about and rank movies. Today on the show, we're going to be talking about the sci-fi sensation Dune, going to be talking about all three films that have come out, the 1984 film by David Lynch, and the two Denis Villeneuve directed films. I am your host Xander, and today I have with me Jonnie.
Hello, I am Lisan Al-Gaib.
Buck.
I don't know any of the characters of Dune, so I'm not going to try to even make a joke. I can't pronounce. I'm not going to bother, but I'm here.
And Tim.
I'm here. I'm thrown off immediately because I thought this was like a NPR speaking voice kind of podcast, and now we're making jokes and stuff. So I don't know what to do.
Tim, we can still use the NPR voice, and we can talk.
Okay, perfect.
I'll do
we
the
can
voice
have a bit
the
of
whole.
both.
Yeah, I'll do the voice the whole time.
Well, you just said you don't know how to do you don't know any of the characters, and yet now you're going to do the voice?
The voice of the NPR voice.
Use the voice and compel everybody to subscribe or whatever.
Everyone should just like and subscribe. Smash that like button.
Really helps us out.
Poke the little picture of
But that's not
Xander's face.
The voice, you got to be like, subscribe. Like, that's how you got to do it.
Okay, we've all seen all the movies. From what I know before, we all have varying opinions about the movies.
Mm-hmm.
I will say, for some context, I know both Tim and I have read the book, but neither of you guys have read the book, right?
I thought this was a podcast about watching movies.
Yeah, books are for losers.
Yeah, I don't know why we're even talking
This is for
about
dorks.
books. I don't want anybody to bring up books or this is how it happened in the books. Again, not relevant.
I will say this, though. I think, and I'll get into this when we talk about every movie, every time I hear someone describe the book or I do, like, read a Wikipedia page, I'm like, well, why the fuck isn't this in the movie? Like,
No, we're not doing that.
No, because I think we need to, because I think almost every Dune adaptation fails.
As someone who's not read the book.
Correct.
Cool.
I was about to say, based on what criteria?
Okay, so let's start out and talk about the 1984 Dune, which I think, at least for me, is the one I saw last. I saw both of the Denis ones first.
Same.
I think it's a weird fucking movie.
It's
Very
awesome. It's so fucking strange. I love the production design. It has, like, one of the greatest soundtracks ever, which I've seen performed live. It's amazing.
So, Buck, you're a fan of this?
I mean,
the
no,
1984 one.
it's still not a good movie. I just want that to be clear.
I'm willing to say it's not a good movie, but I am a fan.
Yeah, that's. I would agree. I think, like, there's so much to enjoy in it.
You can recognize that movie's not good and still get something out of it.
I like the performances. I really like that I can understand what the hell is happening in the movie for the most part.
That's
To a
a
point.
really interesting
I know what
perspective,
I
because
know.
I don't know if I agree with that.
I know what every character's feeling, which is my biggest complaints with the Denis.
I don't agree with that at all.
They whispered in your ear.
They make sure that you know.
Yeah, they make sure that I know. I like the sandworm stuff. I like Kyle MacLachlan as Paul Atreides. He is Paul Atreides. I don't know what Timothée Chalamet is doing in the new Dune movies.
Now, Buck, was the David Lynch version, was that your introduction to Dune?
That was my
'Cause it
introduction.
for
I
me.
watched that probably 10 years before the Denis one came out.
Yeah, me
Because
too.
there's
I saw it back in high school.
There's a reference to it in the TV show Chuck, and I'm like a Chuck completionist.
That's not why I watched it.
And I was like, oh, I gotta watch this movie now.
That's the weirdest reason. I think it does crucially matter what order you watch them in, though. Because I watched the David Lynch one for the first time today, and I couldn't help throughout the entire movie, like, thinking, oh, well, that's how they did this part. I think your introduction to it matters a lot.
No, I think that does. And I had that feeling on my rewatch today. And how weird the Lynch one is what makes me gravitate to it.
The thing for me with the Lynch one is that I feel that the pacing is off.
Terrible.
And there's
Oh, yeah.
something weird about it where it's so slow in the beginning.
Yeah.
And then as soon as they get to the Fremen, every plot point happens about one every 5 seconds.
Yeah.
And you just are off to the races until the end.
Yeah, it's like they put it on 2x speed or something.
Yeah. And I kind of, we'll get into it a little bit more, but I kind of think that there's maybe room to trim some stuff from the Denis ones. So maybe I would say that somewhere in the middle is where the real perfect pace of Dune lies for me, between the 6 hours and the 2 hours. You know what I mean? But There's something about where you said you know what's going on, Buck, and Tim said to a point, or Johnny said to a point, and it's like, yeah, you know what's going on until all of a sudden they just go, well, shit, we only have 30 minutes left of this movie. We just got to, like, get through everything.
What I mean by you know what's going on is, like, what I was so taken by in this rewatch, probably because it just came after Dune 2, is there is a scene where Kyle MacLachlan has a nightmare, and he wakes up next to Sean Young, and he explains why he's going to go drink the blue, like, mini golf water. Like, he explains why he's going to drink this stuff, and I do not understand in Dune 2 why Chalamet decides to go drink that water. And that reason alone, I'm like, I get what every character's feeling enough in a given scene in the Lynch one.
You may sort of understand what they're feeling because they're saying it out loud, but you don't necessarily buy that they're actually feeling that, from my perspective.
I just had a hard time buying any relationships in the David Lynch one between characters and how they felt about each other without them saying it, like Tim said.
Yeah, it's kind of weird because I read the book before I watched any,
which is irrelevant,
so,
really, but sure.
so my perspective's been colored a little bit, but the book itself is not particularly cinematic because it's very much in people's heads, people inner monologuing, and David Lynch very much adapted it that way, but it doesn't really translate well to the screen, I think. And Denny, in his versions, very much stepped away from that and made it a much more cinematic experience, which I think is why it's resonating a lot with people. And you do lose some of that internal monologue explaining how characters are feeling or what characters are doing for the exact reasons why they're doing it. But it doesn't really play super great as a film when every scene is just dictated by someone saying exactly what they're going to do or who exactly they're talking to and why.
I can't believe I'm going to defend this. And it's like, again, I want to be clear here. I like Dune. I like all these movies. It's just I'm not in love with any of them. But I love the weirdness of the inner VO. It's just, I think it's ridiculous. I don't think it's executed perfectly, but I think there's a world where that function does work. There's something about it that is so creepy and eerie that just makes me gravitate more to Dune. I'm just in love with the style of the Lynch Dune. It makes me feel like I'm in a place.
My issue with the voiceover and with a lot of how they adapt the movie is I feel like it puts us at a distance, and at no point in the movie does it not feel like it's a movie that's adapting a book. Like, you're just constantly aware of that fact, and they really drive that point home with the constant internal monologues, with the narration. I feel it makes it really hard to get immersed in the world, which is, in my mind, a huge difference from the Denis Villeneuve version.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think that maybe from a plot point perspective, the David Lynch one is probably actually a more faithful adaptation of the book in terms of if you looked at what was on the page versus what you got on the screen. But it actually doesn't feel how the book feels completely in that way.
To me, the book feels like the Denis Villeneuve movies. The David Lynch movie gets close in some ways, but the spirit of it is all off. And I think Xander is right that in some ways it is a lot more faithful, but in my mind, it gets the important stuff wrong. And the Denis version, once I got to that, it felt like the information was doled out a lot more piecemeal, which made it a lot easier to take it all in.
But I guess this was what gets me to my issue with Dune, having not read the book. I feel like I am always fundamentally missing, like, in every single version, and this is why it's like the only point I really give the Lynch one, besides for the extracurriculars, is I don't get Paul. I don't get how I don't get how the story wants me to feel. And I know it doesn't need to tell me how I'm supposed to feel, but every time I watch one of these, I'm always left slightly empty.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, because when Frank Herbert wrote the original book, he felt like people didn't get it, and he felt like they were sort of missing the point he was trying to make about Paul. He, in his opinion, was telling a story about the dangers of charismatic leaders, and partly because so many people misinterpreted it was why he followed up with the first sequel.
I don't know. That's my thing. I don't, and this is what, even though it's not, I much prefer the story you're describing, and this is why I'm like very compelled to read the books now. The point I'll give to the Dune Lynch movie is that, yeah, I get what I'm supposed to get by this movie, and with the Villeneuves, I'm like, I don't feel anything towards Paul. And at least in the Lynch one, which I don't think is a credit to the direction or the script, but I feel something for Kyle MacLachlan.
I feel like you just like Kyle MacLachlan because you keep calling him Kyle MacLachlan and not Paul. You know what I mean? I think you just really like him, which I like him too.
I just, because it's like I don't understand his decisions in Dune Part 2 specifically, and that's really what's just tearing it apart for me. And those are the like, so it's like, I guess it's a conversation for later, but like what? Xander, yeah, what do you guys?
It kind of sounds like you're saying the Paul in the David Lynch Dune is such a simple character that it's easy to understand what he's doing, where he's coming from.
Yeah, but
whereas
the Paul in Dune Part 2 is a bad, complex character. I don't feel, because I'm not.
Well,
that's what I'd argue.
in your
I'm not saying that Kyle MacLachlan's character is great. I just think he's better than Paul in the Dune movies.
Tim and I have also both read Messiah, and between Dune and Dune Messiah, I like Messiah better than the original, and I like that Denny also seems to agree with me. He maybe has verbatim said that, but certainly the way he's talked about it, he definitely seems to be pretty into the stuff in Messiah. And so I think there's a slight unfairness in the fact that we are judging the Dune movies, and technically speaking, these two Denny movies are the same story as the David Lynch one, but the goal for Denny is to make that third one ultimately, which feels more like an epilogue than a sequel. So it almost isn't, you're not really wrapped up with Paul. It's not really the same as the ending in the first one.
I think it kind of goes on what you were talking about, what we're just talking about with Paul as a character. I think in the change of making Paul just like a straightforward hero, as someone who gets revenge on his family and brings rain, like the movie ends with him bringing rain to the desolate planet. In the Lynch Dune, the Fremen are basically just somebody to be helped, and then they're basically just his army. And I think in the other one they have a lot more to do with their specific culture. Like they feel like a full different people with their own society that they want to preserve, as opposed to the Lynch one.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the world building is significantly stronger in the new ones. And part of that is probably a factor of screen time. You know, there's more time to build out some of that stuff, but I think they are super important, and especially, again, talking about the Messiah elements of it and looking at them as their own people.
I think that's 100% right. I mean, as much as I want to defend the Lynch Dune, it's really for that one point I was making. The stuff, I think the stuff with the Fremen is my favorite stuff in the Villeneuve movies.
So as it stands right now, top of the list, uncontested.
No,
Dune
currently Dune 1984 is first.
Yeah, well,
Yep.
can we put
Yeah.
Jordan
Top of the
Marcy's
list.
technically
Dune above it?
uncontested, but feels contested.
What about the unmade novel of a script for a 14-hour movie that was?
So you want to put that one above the one
I
that was
want to put
made?
that above the Lynch one.
After you just defended the Lynch one for about 30 minutes, and now you're like, actually, I think one that never got made is actually better.
I would maybe agree with that.
Some of the practical filmmaking is cool. Some of it is janky as shit. The shields are
Shields
insane.
Are really bad.
But some of
sandworms
The
look
practical
really good.
pugs were cool.
That one shot where Patrick Stewart is running
that was
into
the best
battle.
part of the entire movie.
Yeah, holding
That
a
was easily
pug
the best
is
part.
insane.
A lot of the production design in that movie is really good, but I do have an issue. I feel like a lot of the sets feel really small, and
I totally agree.
but even like the desert feels so small. It feels you could almost be forgiven for thinking they shot on a back lot and just drove in some sand. But they filmed in Mexico. They filmed on a real desert.
All right, you guys want to get into Dune Part 1
Sure.
from 2021.
The best one?
Oh, you think the best one?
Oh,
Interesting.
without a doubt. Dune.
Oh, you think the best one?
Interesting.
Without a doubt. Dune, Denis Villeneuve, number one, is the best Dune.
It's so hard to keep track of Buck's opinions on things.
No, my ranking has been the same.
I thought the Hodorowski Dune documentary was
That is my number one, but I was told before that I could not rank that my number one.
Where does Chuck line up?
Oh,
in it?
when Chuck dances as a sandworm in the Chuck season 1 Halloween episode, I'd say
that's number one.
That kind of transcends the list.
Yeah.
I think I'll say first of all that the decision to split the book into 2 movies, I think it's very well justified. It is interesting to bring up the Hodorowski Dune, which fell apart mainly because it was going to be like 10 hours long. People have struggled with adapting the book into a reasonable length. I learned recently that Frank Herbert himself took a crack at the screenplay after the Hodorowski Dune fell apart, and he designed it as a 2-part film. And then when he left, Ridley Scott was going to do a 2-part film, and then it went to David Lynch. But a lot of what makes Dune unique are all of the different cultures and the lore and the history and the various schemings and the characters and everything. So I think, it's worth it to sort of spread your legs a bit and
Excuse me?
do 2 parts.
What was the phrase you just used, Tim?
Have you never heard that phrase?
I'm pretty sure
before?
it's spread your wings, but you said spread your legs?
I feel
It's a Fremen phrase. It's a Fremen phrase.
Is it
You guys
Fremen
know
phrase?
that.
To spread your legs? No, listen.
Yeah.
I would.
It's part of a prophecy.
I would spread my legs for Timothée Chalamet, but that's kind of.
You were just shitting on him like 20 minutes ago. You said he sucked, and
No, that's my point.
Kyle MacLachlan was your guy.
I would spread my legs so I could easier shit on him.
Oh, just shit on him.
Well, I think sort of on the cramped David Lynch sets, you don't have as much room to sit, but the Denis Villeneuve sets are much bigger, so you can spread your legs a bit.
I think for me, though, that's where the Denis films really shine for me. Just overall, like, the immersion of his Dune films are really, really good. And I think it has to do with the way that it's shot on a lot of locations with big, huge, sweeping, like, areas. Like, you really feel like you're there a lot more than when you're watching the old one. You're very clearly, like, a lot of the scenes in the desert, you're like, this is just them in front of a rock wall. But the immersion is just not there in the same way. And I think it also extends to the characters themselves. The conversations between characters, I feel they're much more human in Denis Villeneuve's one. Like, for example, Duncan Idaho is a character where him and Paul are supposed to be great friends, and you do feel that in the Denis Villeneuve one. And when he dies, it's genuinely, like, disappointing. When he dies in the Lynch one, you're like, oh yeah, he's died. Like, it truly means nothing.
His death in Dune 1, Part 1, is fantastic. Like, that whole build-up of Jason Momoa, another character I'd spread my legs for, is just...
Are you using it in a good way or a bad way?
Well,
Because
for
I don't
Jason
know if you
Momoa,
mean...
I'm using it in a good way.
Okay. It's up for the
It's up for
viewer to
debate.
decide.
I think it's kind of like you could put your own meaning into it. No, all the characters are so much stronger than anyone. I think that you also get a sense of... I love how many worlds we see pretty quickly. We see the Atreides' home planet. We see Arrakis. We see the Harkonnens. We see the Bene Gesserit. I love all of those worlds and all of those spaces, and they all feel so distinct.
What I would say about the first Dune movie, though, is to not only lump praise on it. I do feel like, even as someone who read the book, there is a lot of stuff in there that is sort of blink and you miss it in the Denis one. Yeah, the vibes of Dune are immaculate. The production design is great. Like, the cinematography is great. The costumes are great. You feel really embedded in the world. Yeah, the music is great. You feel really embedded in that. But also at the same time, there are certain elements of the world building that, despite having so much more screen time, do kind of feel like they get glossed over a little bit for me sometimes.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, and I guess, ultimately that's the trade-off between, what you would maybe consider to be bad dialogue, which is someone
that's true.
Yeah, for sure.
stating outright what they're feeling and what they're doing and what they've done, versus trying to leave things between the lines, and sometimes you pick up on it and sometimes you don't.
Are those our only
For
two
sure.
options though?
I don't think the Denis Villeneuve movies are perfect, and I think there's definitely difficulties with the adaptation, and I think when you're adapting a book that's this dense, and it's a long book, but it's very dense with details about all sorts of different things, you do have to pick and choose. And I think in a lot of ways they make good decisions about what to leave out. Like, for example, the mentats, which are the human computers. There's a huge backstory there about the Butlerian Jihad.
I'll say,
sure.
but I want to
And
hear
how,
that. I want to know that.
computers are
I
outlawed
wish
and
it was
stuff.
in
I
it
wish
too.
that was
But
in.
I think they've made a decision, which is that it simply is not relevant enough to the story to spend time on. And I think in that case, it's justified. But
I mean, I can respect the decision, but I do feel like one positive I can give to the Lynch one is that they thoroughly throughout the movie explain why spice is important. And that's one problem I have with the Villeneuve one, is they're constantly going, whoever has the spice has the power, but they barely explain what spice is used for and why it's important to the galaxy. In maybe one line in the first one, they're like, it's how we travel. But it's like a very small line.
It's like a MacGuffin.
And I feel like it's like a MacGuffin, where really that's the crux of the entire story.
I was going to say about the Jihad before we get too far away from it. It's interesting, though, with Denny being so into Messiah and where it's leading, and it clearly, I won't put words in his mouth about what he's going to do with Part 3, if and when he makes that, but at least the way he sets up the way that Part 2 ends seems to be very much taking the negative spin that the sequel book takes of this jihad that happens around Paul of the Fremen amongst the galaxy. It's kind of interesting to exclude that piece of information, because I think that is something that Frank Herbert is doing, of this idea that history repeats itself.
Yeah, for sure.
And there's this thousands of years ago jihad that happened, and the galaxy is forever changed, and we're still suffering the repercussions of this insane galaxy-spanning war where we don't even have computers and technology anymore because of it. And look at the status quo as it is now as a result of this thing, and then Paul starting another one. So I actually think it's a weird omission from Denny based
agree.
on the take that he's doing.
That's a really good point
of the story.
That is an interesting point. I do feel like those themes do make it through strongly regardless, but yeah, that could have been more ammunition. And I think there's a lot of sort of dangling pieces that don't get fleshed out as much. I think they were arguably too faithful to the book in some ways. I think if you look at sort of the Atreides clan in the first movie, there's Gurney Halleck, Duncan Idaho, Thufir Hawat, and Dr. Yui, and that's maybe one or even two too many supporting characters. They probably should look to compress some. When Dr. Yui betrays them, there's not that much of an impact because we don't really know him that well.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And then, it's just like, yeah, there are certain elements that get left by the wayside. I do think that there is, that's not necessarily a bad thing in all ways. Like some of these things we're talking about, they probably could have found a way to work in. But I like a world where not everything is explained. Like it feels like there is so much detail beyond the surface that they're not explaining, but you can tell is there. It makes the world feel really full.
I was listening to a few I was just like listening to a few like YouTube reviews on, the newest Dune and then Dune 84, just as I was like refamiliarizing myself with it. And it was like, I think it was Film Journal was just listing all the influences, but the influence I didn't think of till I heard it in the list was The Matrix. And I really feel like the Matrix trilogy follows the arc that Dune wants me to feel in terms of how they do Neo. I feel like how the Matrix trilogy does Neo is how Vinny movies want me to feel a bit about Paul.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point about The Matrix. I hadn't considered that. They're definitely dealing with similar ideas. In many ways, Dune feels like the subversion of a lot of what came later. Paul's hero's journey is sort of inverted, and it's interesting to compare it to something like Star Wars. You think about Luke, he's trapped on the desert world, and he's looking to get out, and you think of the image of Luke staring at the binary sunset, and that's sort of him yearning for adventure, yearning to leave, to go to space, to explore, to spread his wings. There's what I feel like is a reference to the binary sunset in the first Denis
without
Villeneuve
a doubt,
Dune film.
I feel like it's like a
where
direct...
where before Paul leaves Caladan, he's walking along and he takes a look out at the sunset, and it feels like it's calling back to Star Wars, but Paul's in a completely opposite place that Luke is, where for him leaving home is obligation.
And also, just like we were talking about The Matrix, like how Neo is one spelled backwards, Paul is actually Lisan al-Gaib spelled backwards. Not a lot of people know that.
We're all going to agree that Dune 1 goes above the
Yes.
David Lynch.
Yeah.
I love Dune 1. I think it's sick.
I think the movie is unbalanced and imperfect, but a lot of the characters I care for. I love the worlds, I love the music, and I understand what's happening in the story and where we're going and why things happen. And also, the scene when the sandworm first attacks is one of the coolest action sequences of the last 10 years.
To give a shout out to the David Lynch one, the shot where the sandworm eats the crawler in the
it's
David
awesome.
Lynch one, the same scene, is actually a cool shot.
Yeah, it was cool.
Yeah, there's a lot of cool... The sandworm stuff I think looks great in the Lynch one.
So as it stands, we're going to put Dune Part 1, the Dune 2021 as number 1, and then Dune 1984 as number 2 on the list, which brings us to the last Dune we're going to be ranking today on this list, Dune Part 2 from 2024.
Fire movie. Sick-ass movie. Movie rules. I think we're spending a lot of time talking about, like, the nitty-gritty of, like, oh, this character's not in it, they don't explain this enough. I feel like we got to talk about how Denis Villeneuve has made, like, 2 of the best sci-fi movies, like, probably ever, visually. I think Dune Part 2 is one of the best sci-fi movies ever made from, like, a visual standpoint.
Yeah, the visuals are pretty on point. I mean, in both of the movies, but 2 kind of does escalate the game. I mean, everyone is going to talk about the Giedi Prime black and white sequence, which is
The best part of the movie.
Obviously the second part is way bigger on the action than the first part. And
Yeah,
I think
definitely.
there are so many really successful action set pieces.
So well directed,
Like,
and so like the
Yeah.
the spatial stuff and like the payoffs. I love the sequence when they raid the first spice harvester, and the buildup of them coming out from underground to running underneath to the device of the moving arms and the helicopter. It's just so clever and well thought out.
And I think that's a great sequence too, because of where they put it, where it almost feels like Paul and Chani's first date in a way, like they've been flirting up to that point, and then they take down this harvester together, and she is clearly someone that is a fighter, and this is the kind of things that she values. So it feels like a really important part in their developing relationship. So it's not just fun action, like there's it's a character beat as well.
And they shot that dude with a rocket
That's
launcher.
the best. It's when she fucking
sick.
spins and blows that guy up.
That was so
I didn't
sick.
expect that, and I was like, "Oh damn, I'm gonna have fun in this movie." And then I just didn't, and I didn't give a shit for the rest of the movie.
Shut the fuck
All
up.
right.
Because you know what? There's
All
so
right.
many good individual parts of
took
this
a
movie,
turn.
but and this I've been saying this the whole time. I don't understand any of the decisions Paul makes in this movie.
I don't really want to be on Buck's side.
But you are. Come
And
on,
I'm
come
not
to the
fully
dark
on-
side.
I'm not
Come on,
fully.
come on,
I'm not
spread your
fully on
legs,
Buck's side
spread your
because
legs.
I think there is an element of truth to what Buck is saying, and we touched on this a little bit, Tim, but some of the stuff that Denny is doing is specifically with Messiah in mind. And in the book, to my recollection, and certainly in the David Lynch movie, to talk about that since that's actually relevant to this ranking conversation,
More book talk.
Paul goes along with the prophecy a lot more willingly than he does in Dune Part 2. That's sort of an added layer as well as the Chani not believing in him being the Lisan al-Gaib. And I think that it's a little bit clunky because it's added. It feels a little bit less refined than some of the other stuff where the moment that specifically Buck keeps complaining about, at some point he just goes, I have no choice. And you go, okay, sure, that's fine. Go drink the water, I guess.
I think it does happen a little fast, but they do some explaining because he talks to Gurney. And
Gurney
Gurney's
tips him
like,
over into doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, Gurney is like, war is in your future. You know it's inevitable. And then he doesn't want to go, but then whatever, fate attacks their siege and destroys it and kills a bunch of the people. And then I think he gets to a point where he's like, war is inevitable, and if I drink the water of life, it's the best chance that we're going to have. If I could rally everybody in the South and organize it.
The change that's maybe harder for people to understand is how he acts after he takes the water, where suddenly he's, very gung-ho, taking up the role of Messiah, at the War Council. He's, yelling at people.
But to me, that honestly makes more sense, too. Because once he drinks the water of life, the explanation is that he knows everything that's going to happen. So he is acting in the way to best suit them.
Which is why I think it is slightly muddled when he's in the beginning trying not to do it. Because ultimately, the character is a character that takes advantage of the situation for self-preservation and for revenge.
Yes,
that's
and
ultimately
I feel like that's not
communicated.
communicated. That the fact that he's doing it for revenge, it feels like he just doesn't have a choice.
No, I think that's still in there.
But one of the most badass lines is Jessica says, "Your father didn't believe in revenge," and he said, "I do."
Yeah, right.
Because I feel like it wants its cake and eats it too in this way, where it's like he's doing this for vengeance, but it's his only choice. And I hate that. I
don't think I fully agree that he's doing it for vengeance. I think that's how he starts out. I think there's supposed to be some nuance here, and I think it came across for me. And if it didn't, for you, that's fair. But I think the idea we're supposed to take is that at the beginning of part 2, and at the end of part 1, he's meeting up with the Fremen. He's looking for revenge for what they did to his dad, what they did to his family. But I think he integrates himself with the Fremen, and then it no longer becomes that sort of, it's no longer about retribution. It's more about what the Fremen want, and he sees himself as one of them, and he sees his goals as their goals. There's a scene where he is sitting on a sand dune, and he puts the ring away, his father's ring away, and he says something like, "Dad, I found my place," which is a callback to in the first film where they're talking about what his future will be like, whether he'll be a duke or what have you. So I think there's an initial change there.
I'm with you that I think that those things come across in it. I think just for me and my taste, I already said earlier, I love Dune Messiah. I think it's way more interesting than Dune. I think there's something to a character that does something bad unknowingly and then is forced to face the repercussions, which is kind of how I read Dune and Dune Messiah, where it's this reflective thing of, I saw the future. He always knows where it's going from the beginning. He knows it's leading to this holy war. What's the line in the movie? Like the holy war with my father's flag flown, right? He knows that, but he doesn't quite realize the repercussions. And then it's that, oh, fuck. That is a bit more compelling to me than somebody who knows it's bad, knows the repercussions, and goes, well, I guess I have to. That, I think, loses my interest slightly from the source material. But again, that's just my interpretation of the source material. I think that this interpretation is valid, and I get it, and I do think it works the way that it's done. It's just not what I took away from it, and I think that having a character, when in anything, not just in Dune, anything where a character kind of knows they're doing wrong, you lose an amount of sympathy and amount of understanding with them when they go, uh-oh, at the end of it. Whereas if they've done wrong and then they go, holy shit, I did not think that that's what was going to happen. You don't necessarily, it's not even sympathy, but I think that is a more universal experience. Is everybody doesn't always think through. Nobody has prescience, you know what I mean? In real life, we don't all see the future. So we're constantly dealing with this idea of looking back with hindsight.
I don't feel like I agree with the analysis that like Paul doesn't have a choice. I think that like he does make a choice. Even though when he goes to get the holy water, like he is put into a corner. I agree with that, to get things that he wants. But I honestly think ultimately these Dune movies are about choices. I think in the very first movie, when Paul first talks to his father, he tells him a leader is somebody who answers the call when they're called to be led. And I think that is a lot about what these movies is about, like fundamentally, that he is being called to be led, to be a Messiah. All of this stuff has been put him up on this platform by the Bene Gesserit, which he didn't have control of, right, but he exists in it. And that he has the choice to lead them and start this holy war, or not lead them and potentially, you know what I mean, not get revenge, lose the people he loves. Like that is a potential by not leading them. But he makes the choice to do it. And I think Chani represents the choice to not do it, the choice to be a good, I don't want to say good person. Because that's the thing, I'm like,
it's this idea where I feel like neither choice is morally correct, which is interesting, but yeah, I feel like the movie,
I think that's what makes him a good character.
But I feel like the movie doesn't even linger with that at all, and I really feel like the way I'm leaving the movie is we're supposed to be like, Paul fucked up. And
from Chani's perspective, he did. Chani's one side of the coin, which is not to look for power and to be a part of a community and not try to like pull the rug out from under people. And then there's also a line towards the end where the Reverend Mother says like, there are no sides to Jessica. I think it's the point of that is that they're all kind of on the same shitty side. The Harkonnens, the Bene Gesserit, the Atreides, all of them are on this side of that they want power. And Chani is the flip side of that. And I think he has the opportunity to gain power and be a leader, and he chooses to go through with that.
I think the movie is, inviting these questions and these conversations and these debates. I think Jonnie is completely spot on. It's about the movies and the book. They're about choices, and there's not necessarily a specific message that they're trying to send, but it is about agency, and we're supposed to be left with a bit of ambiguity about to what extent do these characters really have free will, especially when stuff like prescience is involved.
Sure.
Yeah. What choices could they have made? What would have been the alternative? Is there even an alternative? Is this the only way it could have gone? Like I think that's what these stories are talking about, and I find that ambiguity really compelling personally.
Yeah.
I just wish I wish it was a little bit more. I feel like there's no realm where I feel a success in this. I feel like the movie is all Paul. Like the movie, when I left that movie, the only vibe I got is that Paul made a mistake, and I didn't get like I feel like the ending of this movie is just like Paul sucks now. He's kind of a dick. He's becoming this like piece of shit leader, and I feel like that. I'm just not. I understand the logic of all this stuff. I just didn't feel it when I was watching the movie.
All right, I wanna ask a question to the group to wrap this out on Dune Part 2. When Dune Part 2 came out, I feel the conversation around it was that it was mind-blowing and so much better than the first one. And I don't say this as a discredit to Part 2. I think more so as people, Jonnie kind of touched on this earlier, people underestimating in Part 1.
Yeah, Part 1's so underrated.
I thought people liked Part 1.
I feel they're the same. They feel. I think in a good way. I think that they very much feel like two parts of the same movie.
Yeah.
I don't find there to be a very stark contrast between them where I watch one, I go, this one's boring, and I watch the other, I go, this one rules. And I feel they're very similar. Yeah, maybe there's a little more action heavy in Part 2, but maybe there's a bit more character stuff I like in Part 1. I don't know. Do you guys have a very strong difference between them?
My feeling,
Tim? I'll just say it
Buck,
quick.
since you've been teasing it the entire episode.
It's just,
go ahead.
I agree with you in a lot of ways where it's like it feels like a consistent story. Like you watch a lot of like part 1, part 2 movies. There's always one that feels like real janky in my mind, like the Kill Bills, the last 2 Matrixes, even like the last 2 Harry Potters. There's like this part 1 and part 2 where I just feel like there's this disconnect, and this really does feel like one story. I just don't give a shit.
I thought you loved Dune.
I am all over the place because I don't really know how to feel about these movies.
But why do you need to know how to feel? Like, people can have different opinions. Like you saying, like, you leave the theater and you kind of think Paul's a dick. Like, I think that's a fair thing to feel.
I don't feel confident that the storytellers don't want me to know how I feel. There's something imprecise about Dune 2 that is what bothers me. And I don't think it's imprecise in an ambiguity way. It's imprecise in a way where something isn't just computing with me in some realm.
I think Dune 2 is better, but that's not a discredit to Dune 1. I feel like a lot of people say, like, oh, finally, this one's good. Like, I sat through the first one, but now it pays off. I like both of them a ton, but I do think part 2 is better. I just think it offers more in terms of, like, more humanization and the romance, and I think higher action and also a better ending, where I think the ending of the first one is just like, oh, where will they go now? But the ending of this one I think is a lot more powerful. Agreed. Because there are a lot of questions that go along with it of like, how do you feel about it? The first one, there isn't really any way to feel besides like, oh, what's going to happen to Paul and Jessica? You know what I mean? There isn't any.
Yeah. Like,
which is fine. It's fine for a part 1, but I do think that this one ends on something where it's saying something about the charismatic leader, and you can make a decision on your own if you feel for Chani or you feel like Paul's doing the right thing. I think that is stronger.
So for me, I think I agree that they're very similar. They're on a very similar level for me, and it really is hard to separate the two of them in general because they share a lot of the same strengths. I mean, it's the same cast and crew on both for the most part. It's actually impressive that we're talking about these other 2-part movies that aren't as successful.
And they filmed back-to-back.
And those were ones that were exactly filmed back-to-back, and this one wasn't filmed back-to-back. But they feel such a piece with each
without
other.
a doubt.
I think that's really impressive.
That's impressive,
It
too.
is so crazy.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think for me, part 2 is definitely the one that I gravitate towards more. I don't know if I'm going to say it's objectively better, although I think personally for me, I think the narrative is tighter. I think it's more successful. I think part 1 gets a bit flabby towards the end. And I think some of the changes that were made in the adaptation in part 2 are stronger. Special shout out to Paul riding the sandworm, which I think is
cool.
Maybe my favorite scene in either movie. And I think the ending of the movie is really powerful.
All right, so Tim and Jonnie are leaning Dune 2.
Yeah.
Buck is leaning Dune 1. So I mean, I could tie it, but I don't think that I will. And
dick.
Because what we said the rest of the time, I like Messiah, and Dune Part 2 very much is leaning into a lot of those themes of Messiah that I do like. And I don't think either of them are perfect movies, but I think they're both really solid. And I'm a huge sci-fi person, so I'm super down for there to be some cool sci-fi movies out there.
I think it's also worth talking about how Dune 2 has amazing performances. I think the best performances of the 3. I think Timothée Chalamet and Zendaya and Austin Butler and Javier Bardem are like all really, really good in Dune 2.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's just, and that's part of the thing with payoff. There's more chance for those sort of big emotional showcases.
So we've got Dune Part 2 from 2024, number 1 on the list. Dune Part 1, 2021, number 2 on the list. And rounding it out is the original Dune movie by David Lynch, 1984.
Well, it is worth mentioning that no hot takes are really happening here with our final ranking.
Yeah, I think this is
the consensus. Yeah. And we're doing that for the views. We want people to like us and agree and think we have good opinions.
Exactly.
No, Buck wants to put in a hot take, but we're crushing it. Fuck your hot take.
Hey, thanks for listening, everybody, to Rats on Film. Please follow us on Letterboxd at Rats on Film Pod. Follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And we'll be back soon for more ranked lists of films.
I feel like I look really bad in this podcast.
Yeah, I think you do too.
I think I look terrible. I think I'm gonna, like, I feel like I'm gonna come back after Messiah and like regret a lot of the stuff I say or something like that. But right now I'm holding my guns.